Well, we proceeded with rendering the component programmatically, but now when we tried to test it, we had this strange error. And a quick side note here, if you're not getting this error, if it just works for you, then this is the case because you are using Angular 9 or higher. This is simply a tiny change that was made behind the scenes of Angular, so the general syntax and so on didn't change. What I showed you works in all Angular versions, but in Angular 9 or higher, there was a behind the scenes change which makes this work out of the box, which of course is great. But if you are getting this error, which is also not unlikely because not everyone is using the latest version, well, then here's why we get it. It didn't find a component factory for alert component. Well, we created one here, right? Why didn't it find that factory? Well, ignore the first part. This here is the interesting part. Did you add it to ng module entry components? For this, you need to understand how Angular actually works behind the scenes when it comes to creating components. Of course, any component, as well as directives and pipes, you plan on working with, you need to add them to your declarations array. And we did this for the alert component. We did this for all the components that were loaded. This is important for Angular to understand what's a component or which components and directives and so on you have in your app. Because it does not automatically scan all your files, you need to tell it which components exist. Still, this alone only makes Angular aware of it, so that it is able to create such a component when it finds it in one of two places. The first place would be in your templates. If in your templates, let's say of the recipe list component here, if it finds something like app recipe item, like this selector, it basically looks into the declarations array, finds it there, and then is able to create that component. Great. The other place where Angular will look for this component is in your routes. In your route config, when you point at a component there, Angular will also check that in the declarations array, and if it finds it there, it is able to create such a component and load it. Now, one place that does not work by default is when you want to create a component manually in code, which is the exact thing we're trying to do in the auth component. There, we're creating our own component factory with the alert component, and now here, Angular does not automatically reach out to the declarations array. It simply doesn't do that. You can complain about that, still it's the case. You instead deliberately need to inform Angular that, in this case, the alert component will need to be created at some place and that Angular basically should be prepared for this. It will prepare itself for this creation when it finds a component in the template or in a route config, but here it won't. Now, to tell Angular to be prepared for the creation of that component, you need to add a special property to the object you pass to ng module. Besides declarations, imports, and so on, there is a property we haven't worked with thus far, and that is entry components. Entry components also is an array, and it's an array of component types, but only of components that will eventually need to be created without a selector or the route config being used. So whenever a component is created by selector or you use it with the route configuration, you don't need to add it here, which is why thus far we haven't added anything to entry components. For alert component, it's differently, and there you simply need to add alert component to entry components. Now, one extra note about this entry components property though, depending on the Angular version you're using, you might not need it. If you are working in a project that uses Angular 9 or higher, and you can check your package.json file to find out which version you're using, if you're in a project with Angular 9 or higher, you can omit entry components by default, because their Angular under the hood uses a different rendering engine. Its name is Ivy, and there it works differently under the hood. So the other syntax doesn't change. The only difference is that you can omit entry components. You don't have to. Specifying it there too isn't a problem. You will never make an error if you do specify entry components. Just in some cases you could omit it. Now Angular is ready to create that component whenever you prompt it to, and you do prompt it to create that component here. So now if you save this, after adding that component to the entry components list, and you try this again, you get your component here. And this is now created programmatically in code. But of course, it's not working correctly. We can't dismiss it, and we're also not seeing a message here. How can we make this work? Of course we see no message here, and of course we can't dismiss it by clicking, because in our alert component here, we do have add input and add output, but we're not using property or event binding on our component at the moment because we created it here in code. We can't use the square brackets or the parentheses syntax here. So how can we now pass data into that component or listen to an event or remove that? Well, we simply have to store the component that is created here in some constant or variable with which we can work thereafter. So here I will store my component. However, it's just a reference, a pointer at that component, and therefore I'll name it component ref in this constant. Now we can interact with that component. We can use our component ref here, and this has an instance property which gives us access to the concrete instance of this component that was created here. Now this instance should have the properties we added to our component. So it should have a message and a close property because both here are properties of the alert component. And indeed, if we type a dot here, you see close and message here. So now we can set message here equal to the message we're getting as a string. And this should ensure that the message is displayed. Let's give this a try and let's save everything and try logging in with wrong credentials again. And indeed, here's our message. Oh, that's great. Now for closing, we simply manually have to listen to our close event here. And for that, I again reach out to the instance and then to close. And remember that close in the end here is just an event emitter. Now, you learned that you should use event emitter basically only here when it's decorated with add output. And whenever you manually subscribe to something, you would want to use a subject. Here is basically the only exception to that rule. Since this is a component where we have add output, because we could use this component by selector as well, we have an event emitter, and yet here I manually want to subscribe. And here this is okay. So here we subscribe to this, and whenever this fires, we'll run this function which I passed to subscribe, and in there we essentially want to clear that component reference, right? Therefore, let's first of all store the subscription because we should manage this manually here. Private close sub, which is of type subscription, which is imported from RxJS. Because the event emitter from Angular is based on the subject actually, and therefore it has the same type of subscription. So here I'll store this. Close sub. And now when we do close it, so when we make it into this function here, we can call this close sub unsubscribe because I want to clear that subscription because I know that this component will be removed. And of course, to remove the component, we use our host view container ref, and there we can call clear again to clear all content that was rendered there. Now let's give this a try. Click on the backdrop, and it's gone. Let's try this again. Let's also inspect it in the DOM. Here we can see it is being rendered. That's the app alert component. If I click close, that indeed is removed from the DOM. So this works. One tiny piece of extra cleanup I want to do is I also want to clear that subscription here if we get rid of the off component. Because if that off component is removed, we also don't want to have that old subscription here sit around anymore. So I will implement on destroy here into the off component. On destroy, of course, is imported from add Angular core. And with on destroy imported, here we have to add ng on destroy. And there I want to check if we have an active close subscription. And if we do have one, because we only have one if we showed that error alert, therefore we need to check for the existence of this first. If we do have one, then I want to unsubscribe. And now this ensures that when we do see that error here and we somehow would get rid of that off component, we have no real way, but still then we would not have that ongoing subscription anymore. So with that, now I can close this and I'll try again with correct credentials, and this now looks way better. So this is how you can dynamically create a component from inside code. In this module, you learned about two ways of creating a component dynamically. The simpler approach is by using ngIf, and as I mentioned already, I recommend using that approach as often as possible. If you have no strong reason for managing this in code, for example, you're creating a third-party library and want to give users of your library an in-code way of showing an alert, that would be a good reason. But if you have no strong reason, definitely consider this. It's way easier, and Angular does all the heavy lifting for us. And remember, this doesn't render anything in the DOM if this condition here is false. So you're also not cluttering your DOM with unused or unnecessary content. So strongly consider using ngIf. But if you got another use case, or you absolutely just want to do it programmatically, this is how you do it. You create your own component factory, and then you use a view container reference, which you can get access to with the help of a helper directive, for example. You use that to then dynamically create and render your component with the help of Angular. Important for that approach is that any component you are rendering like this needs to be added to the entry components array in your module, in your ng module. Otherwise, you will get an error. Now, these are the two different approaches. I hope this helps you with your future projects. We are nearing the end of this course, or of the main features of Angular. In this module, we'll have a look at the Angular modules, at this ng module thing, what it exactly is about and how we can work with multiple such modules in an Angular app and why we would want to do that. And we'll have a look at some general optimizations we can add to our Angular app to make it faster, more performant, and prepare it for deployment, which ultimately is, of course, the goal for any application you're building. So let's dive in. What are modules? And with that, I mean the Angular modules. You will also hear the term module when you're talking about the imports you have in your files, when you import something from another file into another file. That also is sometimes referred to as modules, but these would be JavaScript modules. They're totally not related to Angular, and they're not what I mean. I mean that ng module thing that we have in our app, like the app module or the app routing module. So modules in the end are ways of bundling Angular building blocks together. That would be components, directives, services, pipes. You have to group that all together into such Angular modules so that Angular is aware of these features. Because Angular doesn't automatically scan all the files in your project, it doesn't search all the code you write and automatically detect all components and services. Instead, you need to tell Angular what is a component, which components do you have, and you can then bundle them together into modules. Every Angular app needs to have at least one module, that app module. You can't have an Angular app without it. So Angular analyzes these ng modules to understand your application and its features. You use them to define all the core building blocks, components, directives, services, pipes, and so on. An app, as I just mentioned, requires at least one such module, the app module, but you may split it into multiple modules, and we will do that in this course section. You also have core Angular features that are wrapped into modules, things like the forms module, which we added in the course already. So Angular itself also provides certain features grouped together into such modules so that you don't have to declare like 10 different forms directives. Instead, that forms module gives you all these directives. That is how you can think about that. And important also, you can't use a certain feature or building block without including it in a module. How you include it, if you add it to declarations or providers, depends on the feature you are talking about. So let's have a look at our app module and what we're using thus far.